My name is Mia Thompson. I'm 38 years old, a co-founder, a former wife, and, depending on who you ask, the quiet one in the room. For most of my adult life, people have described me with words that sound like compliments but feel like boundaries. Supportive, level-headed, practical. I was the one who remembered birthdays, negotiated contracts without raising my voice, and stayed late to fix problems no one else noticed. I didn't dominate conversations. I didn't interrupt. I didn't demand credit. And because of that, I was underestimated, especially by my husband. We built a business together. At least that's what it said on paper. From the outside, we looked like a modern partnership. Two ambitious professionals turning late-night ideas into something profitable. He was charismatic, bold, and loud enough for both of us. I handled operations, systems, and finances. The invisible architecture. The parts that don't photograph well for social media. When I started dreaming bigger, beyond what we had already built, he laughed. Not cruelly, not dramatically, just lightly enough to make it deniable. A small laugh, the kind that says, "That's cute." That laugh stayed with me longer than any argument could have. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about exposing secrets or destroying someone who wronged me. There are no screaming matches here, no dramatic exits, no shattered glass. It's about something quieter. It's about what happens when a woman realizes she has been standing inside a role that no longer fits her, and instead of fighting for recognition, she simply steps out of it. It's about silence that becomes strategy, about being underestimated long enough to understand exactly where the leverage lives. And yes, eventually, it's about a business sale, an acquisition check, a room where the laughter stopped. But that moment was not the climax. It was just the visible outcome of decisions made in complete stillness. If you're expecting the villain, you won't find one here. My husband wasn't evil. He was confident, comfortable, certain that I would always orbit around his vision. I believed that too for a while, until I didn't. This is the story of how I stopped asking to be taken seriously and started making decisions that didn't require permission. Have you ever been seen as dependable, but never powerful? If you asked my husband, Daniel, who I was during the early years of our marriage, he would probably say I was his anchor, and he would mean it as praise. Daniel was the kind of man who entered rooms as if he owned the blueprint of the building. He spoke in big arcs. Future acquisitions, expansion plans, visionary language that made investors lean forward. He thrived on attention. He was good at it, magnetic. I was the one who made sure the numbers matched the promises. In meetings, I sat slightly angled toward him, laptop open, tracking details while he painted possibilities. When clients asked logistical questions, he would glance at me with a half smile and say, "Mia handles the operational magic." The room would chuckle. I would nod. Operational magic. It sounded whimsical, harmless. But over time, I realized it was a soft way of saying I handled the parts that didn't deserve applause. At dinner parties, friends would ask Daniel how the business was going. He would tell the story, how he spotted the market gap, how he took the risk, how he convinced our first big client to sign. Occasionally, he would add, "And of course, I couldn't do it without Mia." Of course. The phrase floated in the air like a garnish. No one asked what I actually did all day. They assumed I was organized, stable, the detail person, the supportive wife who happened to be good with spreadsheets. Even my in-laws described me that way. "She keeps Daniel grounded," his mother would say, patting my hand as if grounding a man were a full-time personality trait. For a long time, I wore that identity without protest, because there was truth inside it. I was grounded. I was structured. I believed in preparation more than performance. While Daniel networked, I built systems. While he drafted pitch decks filled with bold projections, I stayed up cross-checking cash flow models. When we hired staff, I wrote the contracts. When we scaled, I negotiated vendor terms. When a client crisis hit at 11 p.m., it was my phone that rang. But visibility follows volume, and I was quiet. The strange part is, I didn't feel resentful in the beginning. I felt proud. We were building something. We were partners. I told myself that leadership doesn't have to be loud to be real. Yet subtle patterns began forming. When journalists interviewed us, they quoted Daniel almost exclusively. When the awards came in, his name appeared first. When introductions were made at conferences, he was founder and CEO. I was co-founder and operations. The "and" between those titles carried weight. At home, the dynamic mirrored the business. He chose restaurants. He chose vacations. He spoke for us in social settings. If someone asked my opinion directly, I would sometimes answer before I could finish inhaling. Not maliciously, just automatically. It's difficult to protest something that doesn't feel aggressive. There were no slammed doors, no insults, no dramatic betrayals, just a steady positioning. Daniel is at the center, I slightly to the side. Over time, people began addressing emails to him even when I was the one managing the account. Vendors deferred to him on decisions I had already finalized. Employees looked to him for validation, even after I approved something. I noticed it all, but I also noticed something else, the ownership structure. Early on, when we were forming the company, Daniel had been too busy pitching to handle paperwork. I handled it. I suggested a majority stake in my name for tax efficiency and risk mitigation. He agreed without reading the details carefully. He trusted me with the boring parts. He always trusted me with the boring parts. What no one realized, including him, was that the boring parts are where power lives. At that time, though, I wasn't thinking about power. I was thinking about a partnership, about love, about building something that felt shared. I didn't see myself as invisible. I saw myself as strategic support, the quiet engine, the stable half of a charismatic whole. But there's a difference between choosing to stand slightly behind someone and slowly being placed there. And the shift between those two things is almost impossible to notice until it's already complete. The first time Daniel laughed at one of my ideas, it wasn't in front of a room full of people. It was in our kitchen. Rain pressed softly against the windows, blurring the Seattle skyline into watercolor gray. I had just closed my laptop after reviewing our quarterly performance. We were stable, profitable even, but plateauing. Growth had slowed. Our client base was predictable, safe. Daniel was pouring himself a glass of wine, talking about a networking dinner he'd been invited to. I remember watching his reflection in the darkened window as I said carefully, "I've been thinking about expanding into digital product strategy." He turned halfway toward me. "Like what?" "Like building proprietary frameworks, licensing them, maybe even developing a subscription model for smaller brands that can't afford full-service retainers." I had already mapped out the margins, the scalability, the recurring revenue potential. I had notes in my black leather notebook, bullet points, cost breakdowns, projected timelines. For a second, he just stared at me. Then he laughed. Not loud, not cruel, just light. A short exhale through the nose, like I had suggested we open a bakery on Mars. "Mia," he said, shaking his head slightly, "we're not a tech company." "I know," I replied evenly, "but we don't have to be. We already have the intellectual property. We just package it differently." He took a sip of wine. "That sounds complicated and risky. Our clients come to us because we're boutique, personal. You start scaling frameworks and subscriptions, you dilute the brand." There it was, that word, dilute, as if my idea were a glass of water threatening to weaken something pure. "I ran projections," I said quietly. "It could double revenue in 3 years without doubling workload." He smiled then, the patient smile people use when they believe they're protecting you from yourself. "You're amazing at operations," he said. "That's your genius. But big pivots? That's more my lane." My lane? The words settled into my chest like fine dust. He wasn't angry. He wasn't dismissive in tone. If anything, he sounded reassuring, as if he were gently steering me back to where I belonged. And I nodded, because in that moment, arguing would have felt disproportionate, dramatic. It was just a difference of opinion. Couples disagree all the time. Business partners debate strategy. So I closed my notebook. We moved on to discussing dinner plans, but something inside me did not move on. It replayed the sequence. The laugh, the smile, The lane. The next morning at the office, I watched him pitch an ambitious rebranding campaign to a potential client, an idea far riskier than anything I had suggested. The client hesitated. Daniel leaned in, confident, persuasive. He sold the vision. Afterward, in the elevator, I asked lightly, "Isn't that pivot a bit risky for them?" He shrugged. "Risk sells." I didn't point out the contradiction. Instead, I filed it away. That was the first small cut, not the rejection of the idea itself, but the assumption that vision belonged to him by default. I began noticing subtler moments after that. When I proposed incremental process improvements in meetings, he would say, "Let's keep things simple." When he proposed bold expansions, they were strategic evolutions. When I expressed concern about overextending resources, I was cautious. When he overextended, he was ambitious. Language shapes perception. Perception shapes identity. And identity, if left unchallenged, becomes destiny. The strange thing is, no one else in our circle would have identified what happened that night as disrespect. If I had described it to a friend, she might have said, "He's just being practical." Or maybe he's protecting what you've built. That's the complexity of small cuts. They don't bleed publicly. They don't demand bandages. They simply accumulate. I didn't confront him. I didn't withdraw affection. I didn't grow cold. I adjusted. I stopped volunteering visionary ideas at home. I kept my frameworks in my notebook. I told myself that timing matters, that perhaps he just wasn't ready. But deep down, something had shifted. For the first time, I saw that the boundaries around me were not structural. They were psychological, and he didn't even know he had drawn them. Neither did I until I tried to step outside. The human mind is remarkably skilled at reframing discomfort into something manageable. After that night in the kitchen, I didn't think, "My husband doesn't believe in me." I thought, "He's stressed. He's protective of the brand." Maybe I didn't explain it clearly enough. Rationalization is quieter than denial. It feels mature, measured. And so I adjusted my behavior. In meetings, when strategic conversations drifted toward long-term expansion, I held back. If Daniel's voice filled the room, I let it. When he interrupted me mid-sentence, subtly, efficiently, I told myself he was just enthusiastic. There were no overt put-downs. That's what made it so easy to normalize. At a quarterly planning session, one of our senior managers asked whether we should consider productizing our internal frameworks. My heart paused for a split second. I glanced at Daniel. He chuckled lightly. "We've talked about that before," he said. "It's a little outside our core strengths." I hadn't realized he would refer to it as a shared conversation. It felt like watching my own idea be gently shelved under collective memory. The manager nodded. "Got it." The moment passed. Afterward, Daniel squeezed my shoulder in the hallway. "See? Even the team is curious about scaling. You've got good instincts." It sounded supportive, but support without implementation is just decoration. At home, similar patterns unfolded in smaller ways. When friends discussed investments or market trends at dinner, Daniel would take the lead in the conversation. If I added a perspective, he would rephrase it, polished, amplified, and the group would respond to him. I noticed that I began speaking less, not because I had nothing to say, but because I had grown accustomed to my ideas traveling through him to be validated. There's a subtle erosion that happens when your voice becomes optional. You don't feel silenced. You feel unnecessary. One evening, while reviewing financial statements, I discovered a cash flow vulnerability tied to a recent expansion Daniel had championed. I approached him carefully. "If 2 of these new clients delay payment," I explained, "we'll need to tap into reserves." He waved a hand dismissively. "They won't. These are solid accounts." "I know," I said, "but contingency planning matters." He exhaled, slightly impatient. "Mia, you always look for worst-case scenarios." "Always." The word lingered. Always cautious, always structured, always the brake pedal. He didn't see that I was also the engine. Instead of pushing back, I recalibrated again. I strengthened internal controls quietly, adjusted vendor payment schedules, built buffers he didn't know existed. If he saw my caution as a limitation, I would let him. Because somewhere in the repetition of these moments, a realization began forming, not angry, not explosive, just clear. The dismissal wasn't personal in his mind. It was structural. He genuinely believed he was the visionary, and I had allowed that narrative to solidify, not by agreeing, but by not contesting it. There's a difference between harmony and surrender. I had mistaken one for the other. The more he leaned into his public identity as the bold strategist, the more I was cast as the stabilizer. Employees mirrored that dynamic. They came to me for approvals, but to him for inspiration. They saw him as the future, me as the present. Reliable, useful, invisible. And invisibility, when consistent enough, becomes a role people rely on you to maintain. I could feel it happening, not dramatically, but steadily, like watching the tide shift against the shoreline grain by grain. Still, I loved him. That's the part people misunderstand when they hear stories like this. Love doesn't disappear at the first sign of imbalance. It stretches, it adapts, it tries to make sense of asymmetry. I told myself partnerships have seasons, that perhaps this was simply his season of expansion and mine of stewardship. But a quiet question had begun forming in the background of my mind. What happens when stewardship is mistaken for limitation? And how long can a person stay quiet before the silence becomes something else entirely? There's a moment, if you're paying attention, when you realize you've been cast in a role you never consciously auditioned for. For me, it happened during an industry conference in San Francisco. Daniel was on stage, part of a panel titled Visionary Leadership in Modern Branding. I was seated in the second row, legs crossed neatly, notebook resting on my lap out of habit. The moderator introduced him as a bold strategist redefining boutique agencies. I waited for the word co-founder. It didn't come. After the panel, several attendees approached him. They praised his insights, asked for advice, and requested business cards. A few glanced at me politely, assuming I was either part of his team or his wife. Technically, I was both. One woman leaned toward me and whispered, "It must be exciting supporting someone with such big ideas." Supporting. The word didn't sting. It clarified. On the flight home, Daniel was energized, replaying compliments, analyzing potential partnerships. I watched him as he spoke, animated, confident, certain. I asked gently, "Do you ever think we position the company too much around you?" He frowned slightly, not defensive, just puzzled. "What do you mean?" "In interviews, panels, marketing, it's very founder-centric." He shrugged. "That's just how branding works. People connect with a face." "And what am I?" I asked, keeping my tone even. He smiled in that familiar, reassuring way. "You're the backbone. The one who makes it all real." Backbone. Strong, necessary, hidden. I turned toward the airplane window, watching clouds stretch endlessly beneath us. And for the first time, I saw the architecture clearly. He wasn't intentionally minimizing me. He was unconsciously maximizing himself, and I had accepted the symmetry because it felt stable. At the office, the pattern continued. When new hires were introduced, Daniel explained the vision and culture. I outlined processes and expectations. Employees laughed at his jokes. They respected my precision. Respect is not the same as recognition. One afternoon, a junior strategist came into my office and said, "I love how calm you are. You're like the safe place in the company." I smiled. Safe place. Not a catalyst, not an architect, not the co-creator of the entire infrastructure. Safe. That night, I opened my black leather notebook and flipped through pages filled with projections, risk analyses, and strategic frameworks I had built quietly over the years. Systems that had stabilized revenue, contract clauses that protected us from lawsuits, ownership structures that safeguarded equity. My name was on most of it, not visibly, but legally. That's when the role became undeniable. I was reliable, I was useful, I was invisible. And invisibility is comfortable for everyone except the person living inside it. The truth is, roles are reinforced by reward. Daniel received applause. I received trust. He received visibility. I received stability. Neither of us questioned it because the company was thriving, but thriving can hide imbalance. I began noticing how often decisions were announced to me rather than discussed. New initiatives framed as updates. Risks presented as faillites accomplis. If I raised concerns, they were acknowledged, but rarely prioritized. It wasn't overt domination. It was an assumption. He assumed he led. I assumed partnership meant patience. Until one day, patience felt indistinguishable from erasure. And the most unsettling part wasn't his confidence. It was my compliance. Because somewhere along the way, I had started performing the role they expected. Calm, supportive, operational, so well that even I began forgetting I had once imagined something bigger. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me precise. Because once you can see the role clearly, you also see its boundaries. And boundaries, when mapped accurately, reveal exactly where the exits are. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no dramatic betrayal, no explosive confrontation. It happened on a Tuesday morning in October, inside a conference room that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and whiteboard marker ink. We were meeting with a mid-sized tech company, exploring a long-term retainer. It was the kind of account that could stabilize revenue for years. Daniel was leading the presentation, animated as always. I had built the proposal, every line item, every deliverable, every tiered pricing structure. Halfway through the meeting, the client's CFO asked a pointed question about scalability. Daniel paused. It was subtle, but I saw it, the flicker of uncertainty. He glanced at me. Normally, this was my cue. I would step in smoothly, clarify the model, and explain operational bandwidth. I had done it dozens of times before, like a practiced duet, but something in me hesitated, not out of spite, out of clarity. I realized in that split second that I was about to rescue a narrative that never included me as an equal author. Daniel answered before I could speak. He improvised, confident, charismatic, but technically inaccurate. The CFO nodded slowly, unconvinced. I watched the exchange quietly. I could feel the flaw in the explanation, like a misaligned beam in a structure only I had engineered. And I stayed silent. Not cold, not punitive. Just observant. The meeting ended politely. No immediate commitment. "We'll follow up," they said. Back in the elevator, Daniel exhaled. "I think that went well." I met his eyes. "You misrepresented the scalability model." He frowned. "No, I simplified it. You changed the cost to capacity ratio." "It's close enough," he said, brushing it off. "They won't dissect it that deeply." I didn't argue, but I knew the CFO well. That afternoon, I sent a detailed clarification email directly to the client. Professional, precise, transparent. I copied Daniel. He didn't respond. 2 days later, the client declined the proposal. Their reason was measured. Concern about operational alignment with projected growth. Daniel was frustrated. "They just weren't visionary enough," he said. Visionary. I didn't correct him. Instead, I opened my notebook, and something inside me settled. For years, I had equated loyalty with constant reinforcement. I believed partnership meant smoothing edges, filling gaps, and absorbing inconsistencies to protect the whole. But that Tuesday, I saw the imbalance clearly. If I continued compensating for strategic overconfidence without acknowledgement or authorship, I would spend the rest of my career stabilizing someone else's narrative. And no one, not even Daniel, would realize I was the one preventing collapse. The shift wasn't emotional. It was structural. I stopped asking, "How do we grow this together?" and started asking, "What is actually mine?" Not in anger, in inventory. Ownership percentages, contract authority, signature power, intellectual property rights. I reviewed everything, and what I found wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. The majority equity stake, structured years ago for efficiency, rested in my name. The operational frameworks were documented under my authorship. Banking access required dual authorization, but primary control was mine. Daniel had always trusted me with the boring parts, and I had never questioned why. That night, as he scrolled through his phone discussing potential new leads, I studied him differently. Not as an opponent, as a variable. I realized something unsettling. He believed the business was an extension of his identity. But legally, structurally, strategically, it was balanced on foundations he barely examined. For the first time, I felt something that wasn't resentment. It was autonomy. A calm awareness that if I ever chose to move differently, I could. Not explosively. Not destructively, but decisively. The shift wasn't about proving him wrong. It was about no longer needing his validation to think expansively. And once that internal permission was granted, everything else became a matter of timing. Silence, I began to understand, is not always submission. Sometimes it is preparation. After that Tuesday, I didn't become colder. I became quieter. There's a difference. Coldness is reactive, it carries temperature. Quiet, when chosen, is neutral. Daniel didn't notice the shift immediately. Why would he? I was still handling payroll, reviewing contracts, and refining onboarding systems. I still attended strategy meetings. I still nodded when appropriate. But I stopped offering unsolicited vision. When new expansion ideas surfaced, I listened. When risks emerged, I documented them without dramatizing. If Daniel made bold promises in sales calls, I no longer rushed to soften the edges in real time. I waited, and something interesting happened. Without my constant calibration, small inefficiencies began surfacing. Timelines slipped slightly, budgets tightened unexpectedly, clients asked more detailed follow-up questions. Nothing catastrophic, just friction. Daniel interpreted it as growing pains. He doubled down on ambition, scheduling more networking events, chasing higher profile accounts. His energy increased. Mine became measured. I began blocking 2 hours every Friday afternoon as systems review. No one questioned it. It sounded operational. During those hours, I audited everything: vendor contracts, employee agreements, intellectual property filings. I wasn't searching for a scandal. I was mapping terrain. Silence gave me space to observe patterns without the urgency to correct them instantly. For years, I had equated competence with immediate intervention. Now, I let minor miscalculations breathe long enough to reveal their origin. Most of them traced back to overextension. And overextension traced back to confidence untempered by structural caution. Employees started coming to me more frequently with concerns they didn't feel comfortable raising in larger meetings. I'm not sure we have bandwidth for this new client. Daniel promised a timeline that feels aggressive. I didn't criticize him. I asked questions. I gathered data. At home, our conversations shifted subtly. When he floated ambitious ideas, I responded with, "What outcome are you optimizing for?" instead of logistical breakdowns. If he brushed off risks, I simply nodded and wrote notes later. He interpreted my reduced pushback as agreement, or maybe maturity. One evening, he said, almost affectionately, "I love how you don't stress the way you used to. You trust the process more now." I held his gaze and smiled softly. Trust. That wasn't what had changed. I had stopped fighting to be seen as visionary and started building leverage instead. The key difference between reactive silence and strategic silence is intention. Reactive silence hopes to be noticed. Strategic silence expects not to be. I expected not to be, and that expectation gave me freedom. During one particularly bold expansion pitch, Daniel committed to opening a second office location within 18 months. The team applauded. The idea sounded exciting. I calculated the cash flow implications in my head. Previously, I would have challenged the timeline immediately. This time, I let the applause finish. After the meeting, I asked only one question. If we pursue this, who signs the lease? He answered casually. We both would, obviously. I nodded. Because technically, that wasn't accurate. Primary authorization sat with me. He didn't know the depth of the paperwork he had once delegated, and I didn't correct him. The more he mistook my calm for compliance, the clearer my vantage point became. There is power in being underestimated. Not loud power, not theatrical power, but structural power, the kind that lives in documents, signatures, percentages, clauses. I wasn't plotting revenge. I was recalibrating identity. For the first time in years, my silence wasn't about keeping peace. It was about gathering clarity. And clarity, once complete, has a way of narrowing options until only decisive ones remain. The day would come when movement replaced observation. But not yet. Preparation requires patience. And I had always been patient. The difference now? It was no longer for him. Preparation doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. That was my advantage. No one questions the operations director for reviewing contracts. No one blinks when the detail person updates compliance files or refines documentation workflows. My calendar still looked predictable. Finance check-ins, HR reviews, vendor negotiations. But underneath the surface, I was doing something different. I was building independence. Every Friday during my systems review, I began compiling a comprehensive internal audit, not because anything was broken, but because I wanted to understand exactly how transferable the company was without Daniel's personal brand attached to it. I asked myself difficult questions. If he stepped away tomorrow, what would remain? If the face disappeared, would the infrastructure stand? If the visionary left the room, would the revenue collapse or stabilize? The answers surprised me. 80% of our recurring income came from long-term retainers secured through referrals, not charisma-driven cold pitches. Client satisfaction scores were tied to project delivery quality, something my systems directly influenced. Renewal contracts were negotiated by me more often than anyone realized. Daniel attracted attention. I retained it. There's a difference. Quietly, I began strengthening that retention pipeline. I formalized client communication protocols. I ensured contracts emphasized institutional processes over founder identity. I restructured documentation so knowledge lived in shared drives, not in Daniel's memory. When vendors renegotiated rates, I extended terms to increase valuation attractiveness. When employee contracts came up for renewal, I inserted non-disruption clauses designed to protect continuity during ownership transitions. No one noticed, because it all looked like good operations. At the same time, I began researching acquisitions, not actively shopping the company, just understanding the landscape. What multiples were agencies like ours selling for? What metrics increased valuation? How did buyers assess founder dependency risk? Founder dependency risk. The phrase lingered. High founder dependency lowers acquisition value. Buyers prefer companies that function independently of a single personality. I stared at that sentence longer than necessary. For years, Daniel had positioned himself as indispensable, but structurally, he wasn't. That realization didn't make me triumphant. It made me sober. At home, our marriage functioned as usual on the surface. Dinners, weekend errands, occasional vacations. He remained confident in our shared trajectory. He once said casually over breakfast, "When we eventually exit, it'll be because I've decided we've peaked." I buttered my toast slowly. He believed timing would be his decision. I said nothing. Meanwhile, I started meeting with a financial advisor under the guise of long-term estate planning. It wasn't a lie. I simply expanded the scope of discussion. We reviewed the equity structure, potential liquidity scenarios, and tax implications of majority ownership. The advisor looked at the documents and asked, "You realize you have a controlling interest, correct?" "Yes," I replied calmly. "And your husband?" "He believes we're equal partners." The advisor raised an eyebrow but didn't comment further. I wasn't hiding assets. I wasn't transferring funds. I was understanding the position. Preparation isn't betrayal. It's awareness. I also began documenting every major decision, who initiated it, who approved it, and financial outcomes tied to strategic risk. Not for confrontation, for clarity. Patterns emerged. When growth was sustainable, it aligned with structured forecasting. When margins tightened, it followed ambitious overreach. Daniel never noticed the files I kept. They were organized, time-stamped, and unemotional. Facts rarely shout. They accumulate. The most important shift, though, wasn't legal or financial. It was internal. For the first time, I stopped imagining our future as a single shared narrative. I began imagining multiple paths. Path A, continue as we are. Path B, rebalance leadership publicly. Path C, exit entirely. The fact that Path C existed, clearly, tangibly, changed how I stood in every room. When you know you have an exit, you stop negotiating for scraps of validation. You observe differently. You speak less urgently. You evaluate risk with neutrality. Daniel mistook my composure for contentment. Employees mistook it for stability. What they never noticed was that I was no longer emotionally tethered to maintaining the illusion of symmetry. I was preparing for a future where recognition didn't need to be requested. It would simply be documented. And once preparation reaches a certain threshold, opportunity has a way of appearing, not by luck, but by design. The leverage didn't arrive in a dramatic email or an unexpected offer. It revealed itself slowly, then all at once. About 6 months into my quiet recalibration, I scheduled what appeared to be a routine valuation consultation. Officially, it was for long-term strategic planning. Daniel was traveling that week, speaking at another conference. He encouraged me to handle the numbers. I always handled the numbers. The consultant, a measured woman in her 40s named Rachel, reviewed our financials, client concentration ratios, operational dependencies, and growth trajectory. She asked one question that shifted everything. If a buyer required the founder to stay for a limited transition period but not long-term, would your husband agree? The phrasing was careful. Founder, not founders. I paused. Why do you ask? Because structurally, she said, tapping the documents, your company is far less founder-dependent than it appears publicly. That increases value. Buyers like businesses that can operate without personality risk. Personality risk. I almost smiled. She continued, your operational systems are unusually strong for an agency this size. Recurring revenue is stable. Client retention is high, and the majority ownership is in your name. Yes, I said evenly. She leaned back. If you chose to sell, you would be in control of that decision. There it was. Not hypothetical, not theoretical. Control. For years, I had functioned as if authority and visibility were synonymous. If Daniel was the visible leader, then surely he held the decisive power. But power had been resting quietly in paperwork I drafted years ago while he networked. Rachel slid a preliminary valuation range across the table. The number was higher than I expected. Not astronomical, not life-altering in a cinematic way, but significant, enough to change trajectory, enough to redefine independence. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt still. Because leverage is only useful when it is understood emotionally, not just legally. On the drive home, rain streaked across the windshield in steady lines. I replayed conversations from the past year, his laughter in the kitchen, the My Lane comment, the confident declarations about future exits. He had always assumed the final decision would be his, not because he was malicious, because he equated visibility with ownership. That night, he called from his hotel room, energized from a speaking engagement. You wouldn't believe the connections I made, he said. If we position correctly, in 5 years we could triple the valuation. 5 years. I leaned against the kitchen counter, phone tucked against my ear. What if we didn't wait 5 years? I asked lightly. He laughed. Why would we sell now? We're just getting started. Just getting started. I murmured something agreeable and ended the call. He thought time was abundant. What he didn't see was that time shifts differently when one partner begins imagining life outside the shared structure. Over the next few weeks, I held 2 more discreet conversations with a mergers advisor and a legal consultant. All confidential, all exploratory. The feedback was consistent. Low founder dependency, strong operational autonomy, attractive to mid-sized firms seeking acquisition. The irony was almost poetic. The very invisibility that had diminished my public role had strengthened the company's independence from Daniel's persona, and independence increases value. I didn't tell anyone, not my friends, not my family, not even my closest confidant. Leverage loses power when announced prematurely. Instead, I refined internal processes further. Ensured contracts were airtight, reviewed tax structures, quietly confirmed that any sale would legally require my authorization. Each confirmation felt less like rebellion and more like alignment. For the first time, I understood the full weight of my position, not as backbone, not as support, but as majority owner. That realization did not inflate me. It centered me. Daniel still moved through rooms as if he were indispensable. He wasn't wrong about his value, but he was wrong about exclusivity. I could see the path clearly now. The question was no longer whether I had leverage. It was what I would do with it. And some decisions, once considered seriously, begin to crystallize on their own, quietly. I had reached the point where staying exactly as we were required more self-erasure than leaving ever would. The private reveal wasn't about the valuation number. It was about certainty, and certainty changes posture long before it changes action. Clarity doesn't rush you. It waits. For weeks after the valuation meetings, I moved through life as if nothing had changed. I attended strategy sessions, reviewed proposals, cooked dinner, asked Daniel about his travel schedule. On the surface, we were intact. But internally, I was standing at a crossroads. I laid the options out in my notebook one evening, methodically. Option 1. Continue as we are. Maintain stability. Accept the dynamic. Let Daniel remain the visible architect while I remain the structural engineer. Financially secure, emotionally contained. Option 2. Renegotiate the partnership. Request public co-leadership. Rebrand jointly. Demand strategic inclusion. Risk confrontation. Risk defensiveness. Possibly repair balance if he was willing to see it. Option 3. Initiate a sale. Convert equity into autonomy. Dissolve the business structure binding us professionally. Allow the marriage to either redefine itself or reveal what it actually was without the company between us. Each option had a cost. Option 1 cost identity. Option 2 costs peace. Option 3 costs permanence. I didn't romanticize any of them. The truth is, I didn't crave revenge. I didn't need Daniel to apologize dramatically or acknowledge past dismissals. I wasn't looking to humiliate him publicly. I was asking myself a simpler question. Where do I disappear the least? That question narrowed everything. Option 1 required ongoing self-minimization. Even if I grew more assertive internally, the pattern was deeply embedded. Changing it would require him to fundamentally see me differently, and I wasn't certain he could without first losing something. Option 2 seemed reasonable on paper, mature, collaborative, but I examined it honestly. If I asked for visible co-leadership, it would position me as seeking validation, as he had grown comfortable authoring alone. I didn't want the space granted. I wanted autonomy exercised. Option 3 felt irreversible. Once you explore selling a company, you cross an invisible threshold. You begin detaching emotionally. You assess relationships through valuation instead of sentiment. You convert shared dreams into line items. It felt cold, but it also felt clean. I tested myself quietly. If we sold and he reacted with anger, could I remain steady? If we sold and he felt blindsided, could I defend the decision without escalating? If we sold and the marriage fractured, could I accept that outcome? I sat with those questions for days. There was sadness in them, but not fear. One evening, Daniel mentioned again, casually, that when the time was right, he would know, that he would feel when it was time to exit. He spoke about timing as if it were intuitive, as if instinct alone determined strategy. I listened, and something settled completely inside me. He believed leadership was performance. I knew leadership was a decision. The following week, I scheduled a confidential exploratory call with an acquisition firm Rachel had recommended. I framed it as information gathering, but I already knew. The decision had crystallized not from anger, but from alignment. I wasn't choosing to sell because he laughed. I was choosing to sell because I had outgrown the version of myself that accepted laughter as a limitation. Irreversibility can feel terrifying, but sometimes it feels like oxygen. When I signed the preliminary intent to explore document, my hand didn't shake. There was no dramatic music in the background of my life, just the quiet sound of a pen moving across paper. I drove home afterward and made dinner as usual. Daniel talked about an upcoming pitch. I nodded, attentive, present. He had no idea that the trajectory of our shared enterprise had shifted that morning, not out of spite, out of self-recognition. Some decisions are loud. This one was silent. And once made, it changed how I breathed in every room, because I was no longer asking, should I? I was asking, how soon? Once the decision was made, the work became procedural. There's something almost soothing about logistics when your emotions are already settled. Forms, timelines, NDAs, structured conversations with people who speak in valuation multiples instead of memories. The acquisition firm requested detailed documentation, financial statements for the past 3 years, client concentration breakdowns, employee retention metrics, intellectual property filings, and operational manuals. I had all of it, organized, time-stamped, clean. Daniel assumed I was preparing for an aggressive growth strategy. When I spent longer hours reviewing financials, he said, I love when you get into optimization mode. Optimization. In a way, he was right. I was optimizing exit readiness. The first formal step required my signature alone. authorizing confidential outreach to potential buyers under non-disclosure agreements. Majority ownership carries quite a lot of authority. No board vote required. No co-founder consensus clause. Years ago, when we structured equity for tax efficiency, Daniel had waved off the details. "You're better at this stuff," he had said. I signed. Interest came faster than I expected. Mid-sized agencies looking to expand into our niche, a private equity-backed firm seeking bolt-on acquisitions, a regional competitor exploring consolidation. Each inquiry felt clinical. They asked about founder dependency. I answered honestly. Client retention is driven primarily by delivery teams and operational systems. They asked whether leadership would remain post-acquisition. I responded, transition support is negotiable. Negotiable, not guaranteed. The firm I felt most aligned with moved quickly. Their due diligence team was thorough but respectful. They requested interviews with department heads, framed as strategic partnership exploration. Daniel assumed we were exploring a joint venture. I didn't correct him. The subtlety of the process was almost surreal. I would sit across from him at dinner, discussing weekend plans, knowing that earlier that day I had reviewed draft acquisition terms converting our shared company into a liquidity event. There was no adrenaline, just precision. The letter of intent arrived 3 weeks later. The number was within the higher end of Rachel's original range. Structured payout, retention bonuses for key staff, transition period of 6 months for leadership continuity. Leadership continuity. The acquiring firm requested that Daniel remain as brand strategy director during the transition, after which his role would be reassessed. Reassessed. I read that line twice. Not CEO, not founder. Director. The irony was quiet but unmistakable. Before moving forward, I reviewed every clause with legal counsel. Tax implications, capital gains exposure, marital asset considerations. That last one required careful thought, because selling the company would not just restructure the business. It would test marriage. Our operating agreement required notification of a material structural change, but not prior approval from minority stakeholders. I drafted the formal notice email. I didn't send it yet. Timing matters. In the office, nothing appeared different. Employees continued working on campaigns. Daniel continued pitching expansion ideas. He even mentioned scouting locations for the second office. I nodded thoughtfully. Meanwhile, due diligence accelerated. Data rooms were shared securely. Financial audits confirmed stability. Buyer confidence increased. One evening, as Daniel excitedly described a new long-term growth plan, I realized something profound. He was building 5-year projections. I was finalizing a 5-week transition schedule. Not because I wanted him blindsided, but because I had learned that conversations about power rarely end in mutual revelation. They end in defensiveness, negotiation, and emotional reframing. This wasn't a debate, it was a decision. Silence had carried me this far. Now it carried momentum. The final purchase agreement draft landed in my inbox on a Thursday afternoon. All that remained was signature alignment and disclosure. I closed my laptop gently. The movement was almost ceremonial. The laughter in the kitchen months ago felt distant now. Not painful, just instructive. He had laughed long before I held the acquisition check. Soon he would understand what silence had been building. And when that moment arrived, I already knew one thing for certain. I would not raise my voice. The first signs weren't dramatic. There were subtle shifts in tone. After I signed the purchase agreement, pending final disclosures, the acquiring firm began integrating quietly. Calendar invitations changed language from exploration call to integration planning. Department heads were asked for long-term process documentation. HR requested updated employment files. Daniel noticed the increased administrative activity. "Why are they asking for full retention data?" he asked one afternoon, scrolling through an email thread. "They're thorough," I replied calmly. "It's standard in deeper partnerships." He accepted that explanation, for now. What he didn't realize was that the internal gravity of the company had already shifted. Decision-making authority was transitioning behind the scenes. Financial reporting lines were being restructured. Systems I had built were now being evaluated as transferable assets, not shared creations. Employees began sensing something, though they couldn't articulate it. The senior project manager stopped by my office and said, "There's a lot of documentation review happening. Are we expanding?" "In a way," I answered. It wasn't a lie. Expansion sometimes means absorption. The acquiring firm requested a formal announcement date, 2 weeks out. That was the moment disclosure would become unavoidable. Until then, confidentiality was contractual. I watched Daniel move through the office as usual, confident, expressive, outlining bold ideas for Q4 campaigns. He spoke about growth targets as if they were still entirely ours to shape, and in some ways they were, for 14 more days. The first tangible consequence surfaced during a leadership call when the acquiring firm's representative asked about founder transition planning. "Given the operational independence already in place," she said diplomatically, "we anticipate minimal disruption." Minimal disruption. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Operational independence?" I stepped in smoothly. "They're referencing documented systems and team autonomy." He nodded, but his eyes lingered on me half a second longer than usual. Later that evening at home, he asked, "Do you feel like they're positioning us for acquisition?" The question hung in the air. I chose my words carefully. "They're assessing all strategic options." He studied my face, searching. For years, he had relied on reading my expressions for reassurance. I had always offered it freely. This time, my calm was neutral. He interpreted my composure as confidence in growth, not enclosure. Over the next week, more signs emerged. Legal teams requested updated shareholder confirmations. Banking institutions were notified of the structural review. The acquiring firm asked for digital access credentials to be transferred upon closing. Transferred. Daniel began feeling the loss before he understood it. He grew slightly more assertive in meetings, more animated, as if reinforcing presence through performance. Employees sensed the tension. Energy shifted subtly. Conversations quieted when he entered rooms. Loss often announces itself through atmosphere before information. One night, as we sat at the kitchen table, he said casually, "If we ever sold, I'd want it to be on my terms." I looked at him steadily. "What would your terms be?" I asked. He laughed lightly. "Timing, positioning, control." Control. The word landed between us like fragile glass. I folded my hands together gently. "And if control looked different from what you expected?" He frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said evenly, "sometimes the person holding the structure sees timing differently." Silence followed, not heavy, just unfamiliar. He didn't push further, but something in his posture shifted. A faint awareness, a recognition that perhaps there were elements of the company he hadn't fully examined. The formal announcement was scheduled for the following Monday. He would learn the full scope then, not as rumor, not as speculation, as a fact. And the consequences would no longer be atmospheric. They would be contractual. I slept peacefully that weekend, not because I anticipated triumph, but because for the first time in years, I was not waiting to be acknowledged. I had already acted. An action, once taken, reshapes every dynamic quietly, long before words catch up. The announcement happened at 9 a.m. on a Monday. I scheduled the all-hands meeting myself. Daniel walked into the conference room with his usual energy, coffee in hand, ready, he assumed, to discuss Q4 projections. The acquiring firm's representative joined via video call, her tone professional and composed. I began speaking before he could. "I want to share an important strategic update," I said evenly. "After a comprehensive evaluation process, we have entered into a formal acquisition agreement with Crestline Partners." The room went still. Daniel's smile remained for half a second too long, then faded. "Acquisition?" he repeated lightly, as if clarifying a misunderstanding. "Yes," I said calmly. "The agreement has been finalized. We will transition over the next 6 months. Roles and reporting structures will adjust accordingly." I kept my tone steady, factual, clean. Employees looked stunned but curious. A few exchanged glances that read more like relief than shock. Stability secured, future defined. Daniel turned toward me fully now. "When did this happen?" he asked, voice controlled but tight. "The exploratory phase began months ago," I replied. "Due diligence concluded last week. The board, meaning majority ownership, approved the sale." Majority ownership. The words were deliberate. The acquiring representative continued outlining retention bonuses, growth opportunities, and operational continuity. Applause eventually followed, tentative at first, then stronger as the financial incentives became clear. Daniel did not clap. After the meeting, he walked beside me in silence back to my office. The door closed. "You sold the company?" he said, not shouting but disbelieving. "Yes." "Without deciding together?" "I exercised controlling interest," I answered, "legally and strategically." His hands rested on the back of a chair. "Mia, this is insane. We were building something." "We built something," I corrected softly. He paced once across the room. "You blindsided me." "I informed you within contractual parameters," I said calmly. "There was no clause requiring joint approval." "That's not the point," he snapped, frustration rising. I didn't match his tone. "The point," I said quietly, "is that you believed control lived in visibility. It didn't." He stared at me, anger giving way to something else. Confusion. "When were you going to talk to me about this?" he demanded. "I tried," I said evenly, "in different ways. When I suggested expansion ideas, when I asked about positioning, when I questioned risk." "That's not the same as selling the company." "No," I agreed. "It's the path that led to it." Silence settled heavily now. He ran a hand through his hair. "We could have fixed whatever was wrong." I met his eyes directly. "What was wrong?" I asked. He opened his mouth, then paused. "Because nothing had been visibly broken. Revenue was stable. Growth was steady. Marriage appeared functional. The problem had never been catastrophic. It had been structural. You should have told me you felt—" He searched for the word. "Undervalued?" I offered gently. He looked away. "I didn't think you felt that way," he said quietly. "I know. That was the point." He stepped back slowly, absorbing the reality. The company he believed he would exit on his terms had already been converted into an agreement he would now transition within. The power he assumed was mutual, or perhaps leaning toward him, had been legally anchored elsewhere all along, not through deception, through delegation. And now it was too late to renegotiate. Contracts were signed, funds were allocated, public announcements scheduled, employees informed. Irreversibility has a particular silence to it. He sank into the chair across from my desk. "You didn't even fight me," he said, almost to himself. "I stopped fighting for acknowledgement," I replied. "There's a difference." Panic flickered briefly, not dramatic, not explosive. Just the realization that the narrative he believed he controlled had shifted without his authorship. Too late to veto. Too late to reposition. Too late to laugh it off. He had laughed long before I held the acquisition check. Now there was nothing left to laugh at. Only transition and consequences. Quiet ones. Permanent ones. The real confrontation didn't happen in the office. It happened 3 nights later at our dining table. No raised voices, no slammed doors, just 2 plates of untouched food growing cold between us. Daniel had spent the past 72 hours cycling through stages: shock, frustration, bargaining. He had spoken with attorneys, reviewed the operating agreement, and searched for procedural missteps. There were none. Everything had been executed cleanly, legally sound, structurally precise. That more than anything unsettled him. "I keep replaying it," he said finally, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. "Trying to figure out when you decided I wasn't part of it anymore." "You were always part of it," I said calmly, "just not the final decision." He exhaled slowly. "That's what I mean." Silence stretched, not hostile, just dense with realization. "You should have told me you were unhappy," he said. "I wasn't unhappy," I replied. He frowned. "Then what was this?" I was clear. He leaned back, studying me as if I were a language he had once been fluent in but no longer recognized. "For years," I continued evenly, "you positioned yourself as the visionary. Publicly, strategically, socially. I supported it because I believed partnership didn't require equal spotlight." "That's not—" he began. I lifted a hand gently, not to silence him, but to slow the interruption. "I didn't resent your visibility," I said. "I resented being assumed incapable of my own." His jaw tightened slightly. "I never thought you were incapable." "You didn't have to," I replied. "You just had to believe the big decisions were yours by default." The words weren't sharp. They were factual. He stared at the table for a long moment. "When you brought up selling before," he said quietly, "I thought you were just exploring." "I was," I answered, "until exploration became alignment." "And you didn't think we could realign together?" I held his gaze. I think you would have tried, I said honestly, but I don't think you would have understood without something tangible shifting first. His expression flickered, wounded, reflective, restrained. You took that choice away from me. I exercised mine, I said softly. That was the line between us. Not betrayal, authority. For years, he had unconsciously equated leadership with presence, with voice, with momentum. I had equated leadership with structure. We were both consistent. The difference was that structure outlasts presence. He rubbed his temples lightly. Do you even want to be married to me after this? It wasn't accusatory. It was vulnerable. I didn't answer immediately. I don't want to be small, I said finally. He swallowed. I never asked you to be. You didn't have to. The room felt incredibly still. No rage, no tears. Just two adults sitting inside the consequences of long-standing assumptions. I laughed at your idea, he said suddenly, almost to himself. That night in the kitchen, I met his eyes. Yes, I didn't think it mattered. I know. Another quiet stretch passed. He nodded slowly, absorbing the chain reaction of small dismissals, structural oversight, and delegated authority. I thought you were content, he said. I was patient, I corrected gently. There's a difference. He sat there for a long time, no longer defensive, just recalibrating. I don't know what this makes me, he admitted. It makes you someone who underestimated the quiet partner, I said evenly. That's not evil, it's common. He almost smiled at that, tired, humbled. And what does it make you? He asked. I folded my hands together calmly. Someone who stopped waiting. No drama, no triumph, just truth. And in that moment, the confrontation wasn't about the sale anymore. It was about identity. And identities, once redefined, don't return to their previous shape. 6 months later, the transition period ended quietly. No ceremony, no dramatic farewell speech. The acquisition funds had already been deposited weeks earlier. I remember the moment I saw the final figures settled in my account, not as a rush of triumph, but as confirmation. Tangible proof of authorship. Daniel completed his transition as brand strategy director with professionalism. To his credit, he adapted. Without the title of CEO attached to his name, he seemed softer, less performative, more reflective. We didn't collapse immediately as a marriage, but we changed. When the company was no longer the shared center of gravity, we had to face each other without it. No strategy meetings to anchor the conversation, no growth targets to debate, no shared performance to hide behind. Some couples rediscover each other after structural shifts. We discovered honesty. And honesty, while clean, isn't always comfortable. We attended counseling, not because of betrayal, but because of misalignment. The therapist asked a simple question one afternoon. When did you both start performing roles instead of expressing needs? Daniel looked at me. I looked back. Years ago, silently. Eventually, we made a mutual decision to separate. Not in anger, not in a scandal, simply in recognition that a partnership built on outdated roles rarely thrives once those roles dissolve. There was sadness. Of course there was. But there was no bitterness. The business sale had not destroyed our marriage. It revealed its architecture. As for me, I no longer introduce myself as someone's anchor. I'm still structured, still observant, still disciplined. Those traits never left. They simply expanded. I now consult independently, advising founders on operational design and succession planning. Ironically, I specialize in reducing founder dependency risk. I help leaders build companies that can survive beyond personality. When clients ask how I understand that dynamic so intimately, I smile. Experience is the best instructor. I don't speak about Daniel publicly. I don't frame the story as a victory. He wasn't a villain. He was a man accustomed to visibility. I was a woman accustomed to absorbing it. We both played our parts convincingly, until one of us chose not to. The most surprising part of this transformation wasn't financial freedom. It was internal stillness. I no longer measure my value by how seamlessly I stabilize someone else's ambition. I no longer translate my ideas through another voice to make them palatable. I don't wait for acknowledgement to validate vision. I simply decide. There's a specific kind of confidence that comes from acting without spectacle. It doesn't require applause. It doesn't demand explanation. It just stands. When I think back to that kitchen, the soft laugh, the gentle dismissal, I don't feel anger anymore. I feel gratitude. Because that small moment illuminated something I might have ignored for decades. He laughed long before I held the acquisition check. But the check was never about proving him wrong. It was about proving to myself that quiet does not mean powerless. It never did. I just had to stop confusing patience with permanence. And once I did, everything aligned. When people hear this story, they often search for a villain. They expect betrayal, manipulation, secret bank accounts, or explosive revenge. There wasn't any. There was only one assumption that visibility equals authority, assumption that calm equals contentment, assumption that the quiet partner will always remain quiet. What I learned is this: power rarely announces itself loudly. It sits in documents, in preparation, in self-awareness. In the moment you realize you don't need permission to change your position. I didn't sell the company because I hated my husband. I sold it because I finally understood my own leverage. There's a difference between fighting to be seen and simply moving in a way that makes visibility irrelevant. The world often teaches women that patience is a virtue, that support is strength, that being low drama is maturity. And those things can be true. But patience without recognition becomes erosion. Support without authorship becomes invisibility. Calm without agency becomes containment. Quiet dominance isn't about humiliating anyone. It's about understanding the structure you're standing in and knowing exactly where your name is written. He laughed long before I held the acquisition check. But by the time the check arrived, laughter didn't matter anymore. What mattered was alignment with myself, with my values, with the version of me that no longer needed to shrink to maintain harmony. If you've ever felt dependable but overlooked, respected but not recognized, valued for stability but not vision, maybe the question isn't how to speak louder. Maybe it's this: where structurally does your power already live? And are you willing to use it? I'd love to know your thoughts. Have you ever realized your leverage only after someone underestimated you?